Hola, Budapest. So, I love stories. Books were the very first love of my life. And one of the interesting things that I found is that the story of modernity has been the story of separation in many ways. And the big thing about our stories is that many times we become them. So our story, for example, of humans separated as nature has actually become climate change, as we just heard. And then the story of some humans being more valuable than other humans has also become colonialism, it has become racism. This other story that we're all separate from each other, that right now we're in an auditorium full of strangers, is actually also in many ways a myth. Nowadays we know that our brains are sinking into each other, synapses are firing at the same time, things are being exchanged whether we want to or not. So I've always been incredibly fascinated by this thing that looks like empty space, this thing in between, that is many times, yes, a border and a boundary, but it's also a space of intense exchange. So how do we start thinking about this space between us? How do we become boundary workers? This has been a question that has followed me throughout my life. I have been many things at several moments in my life. So truly thinking about transdisciplinary practices. But one example comes to mind when thinking about the in-between. So at one point in time, many years back, we decided to take 35 artists from all over the world, put them on a flight for 14 hours, 11-hour bus ride, a 4-hour little bus ride to get to Frontera Corozal. And Frontera became a fabulous excuse for us to think about not only borders of being on one side or the other, but how do you actually inhabit a border? Because Frontera actually means border in Spanish. So as an example of one of the projects that we did there was Guatemex, done by Eder Castillo, René Hayashi, and Antonio Connell with a collective that I was part of called Laboratorio Curatorial 060. And this that you see here is actually the river that divides Mexico from Guatemala, and it's a no man's land. There is no sort of jurisdiction in between it. So we created a space, as you can see here, that belonged neither to neither to Guatemala nor to Mexico, but to Guatemex. And there, in 2006, we put internet where people that were actually fleeing many times political persecution, violence in Central America could actually stop on their way to the US to ask for asylum, to see what their rights were, to find out what the safe routes were, where they could actually find food and shelter. And this became, in many ways, one of my interesting moments in terms of journeying into these in-between spaces and the threshold spaces. Another example of my life was when, out of an incredibly strange, serendipitous turn of events, I became Chief Creative Officer for Mexico City. And as such, I founded Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which was officially the experimental arm / creative think tank of the Mexico City government. As many of you might know, there's labs all over the world, and basically our role is to be that liminal space, that in-between space, government and civil society, and allow government to take risks that it couldn't if it didn't have a R&D of sorts within government. So obviously, even though there were examples the world over, Mexico City, where I am from, very much gave the lab its flavor. It's a megalopolis, 21 million people in the metropolitan area, and every number is in the superlatives. It is one of the cities with most resources, fascinating in nature, as well as with some of the biggest challenges a city can face. And so in many ways, the question that we held together was, how can we imagine a city from a different place? So I had a transdisciplinary team. Half of them came from urban and political sciences, the other half came from humanities. And for us, it was just as important to have lawyers and administrators and political scientists and urban geographers working hand in hand with artists, philosophers, historians, writers, et cetera, and everything that we did sat in between, because we wanted to think about the city with tools, but we also wanted to ask the big questions. And of course, Mexico City being Mexico City, we also had a mass wrestler on the team that I used to keep his identity secret until The Guardian ousted him, but I actually love the role that Jorge played, because in many ways, we have to make politics fascinating again. We have to be serious about our cities and the challenges, but we also have to know that we need to bring in other people to think with us. So part of our big challenge, as well as perhaps one of the biggest things that the lab did, was able to gather communities around questions that we were holding. So we created many collaborations with universities, but also with neighbors, and also with designers and hackers, et cetera. But we also wanted to work with what we call the unusual suspects. So we would also think with artists such as Gilberto Esparza, this is one of his projects, nomad plant, which is half robot, half plant. This really works. It's just like a beautiful engineering feat. And this nomad creature has legs that can actually feel the humidity of the ground, so it can walk towards rivers. It can actually purify the water because it takes it for granted that the water is polluted. And then the plant feeds the robot, and the robot in turn waters the plant, if you will, and if you try to catch it, it runs away. So basically, why work with people such as Gilberto Esparza? Because in many ways, you can come to government, to the populations that live along the rivers, and talk about a sense of righteousness of don't pollute the river, or you can actually come with a sense of fascination. You can enter through the kids' perspective first. And you can also world hint, because I think projects like these, what they do is actually open up our possibility that another city is possible. These are some other projects of Gilberto called urban parasites that actually take the electricity from the city and can also live in the wild. So in many ways, one of the things that we thought was, how do we build cities not only for the human body, but also for the human imagination? But this was not only small projects like what we did with Gilberto, but it was also crowdsourcing constitutions, which nowadays is the highest law in Mexico City, and that has guaranteed rights for Mexico City people, such as making Mexico City into a sanctuary city. It has euthanasia, gay marriage, abortion, all sorts of rights that we did not necessarily have before we had a constitution. So in many ways, one of the things that we realized working at the lab was that democracy itself is a desire to be part of a larger story. A story in between us all, if you will. So another example that we had, this is the largest informal bus system in the world. This, even though they look like humble little green buses, it actually moves an astounding 14 million individual rides per day. But the thing is, we know where they start and where they end, and we have absolutely no idea what goes on in between. So since we were the experimental lab, this was one of a delicious challenge, and we did what we always did, was put together a group of people, civil society, government, civic tech folks, and we said, how do we solve this? And we decided to gamify it. So we created a citywide game where people could participate. We created Mapaton, and we also created specific tech with a young tech company, Krieger, that actually allowed for people when they were mapping not to use the data because it's very expensive in Mexico City. And at the same time, it would actually simulate what is called GTFS, which is the data standard for mobility. So that is what Google uses, and it's also what government can use to actually create better plans for mobility, because I forgot to mention that, Mexico City has one of the most painful commutes in the world. So this was really an urgent challenge. So we put out a call for proposals, and we had 4,000 people, 700 teams, and these are the 100 winners that you see. Some of them mapped everything from routes that took 8 hours and a half to and fro, believe it or not. And if you put together all of the kilometers, one by the other, it actually would turn 1.5 times around the world. So this is people power, and this is the first time that Mexico City ever got a map of what was happening on the ground, thanks to collaboration and to people. So that, I think, is the importance of experimentation. We didn't know if it was going to work or not. But it's also the politics of possibility. And I think, in many ways, it makes me proud to know that even though we were catching up with the rest of the world, because, of course, we should have GPS on all of these so we can have the real data, but in many ways, it's also become an example of civic innovation at scale. So Harvard every year teaches the mayors in the mayor school. Mayors come to learn about Mapaton and how you can actually use that citizen talent and that citizen power to be able to solve several things. This is one of the most important lessons I learned at the lab. Your community is your superpower. Things that we cannot do alone, we can do when we come together. And in many ways, since I left government, I was in government for 6 years, and I've been a recovering citizen for the last 2.5. This is what interests me intensely. How do we start thinking about an emerging field of urban and creative practices where cities that are so influential in what is happening the world over, as you know, like 50% of our population lives in them. The cities cover only 3% of the planet, but actually consume almost 70% of the resources. So we have to think very deeply about cities. And I love this quote by David Harvey that says, the question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from that of what kind of social ties, relationships to nature, lifestyles, technologies, and aesthetic values we desire. The right to the city is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. So in many ways, these are the things that I'm interested in. How can we start entangling and finding the in-between spaces, the urban, the political, the social, the creative, the tensions and the translations that is necessary for democracy, as well as start to find out what new language and political forms could be that actually make more people want to be part of government. Since then, I've been working from Experimentalista, my organization, with other questions and other cities, such as can a whole city be reimagined around care with Bogota? Or the politics of play, what would that actually mean with a group in London? And so I actually think that there's a huge opportunity to think about creative bureaucrats. My team actually was the first time that they had ever worked in government, except for my lawyer and my administrator. And I'm seeing the world over that there's suddenly an interest in becoming part of the solutions. This is a fabulous team of Bogota, led by Diana Rodriguez Franco, and what we're doing together is thinking about care blocks. How can we actually restructure, reimagine a whole city around care? But I also think that we need to start thinking about not only policy and politics and the stories that we tell each other, but actually the physical built environment, the architecture. So one of the things that obsesses me right now is how can we start thinking about micro-interventions and architectures for collective life that still allow for us to merge and to meet despite and within our differences. So some examples that I love, this is one of the ones that we did when I was still in government in Mexico City. This is our Zócalo, or main square. And this became actually a pavilion so that citizens across Mexico City could actually share their great ideas and create a contagious effect that I won't go into the really interesting outcomes of this because I don't have time. But Sophie created, artist from the Netherlands, is also a good example. She created a pandemic classroom when there was a lockdown. And look at what a simple gesture, what that can become. So how do we start these small gestures, or what Sarah Hendren, who's an engineer and a designer and has a child, unfortunately, who has disabilities. And she has actually been doing a really interesting project, which is called Disability Visibility, of creating the same ramps, both for the skaters as well as for the people in wheelchairs, putting together really interesting kits, and then hosting in her city competitions where both people in wheelchairs as well as skaters can actually come together and create competitions and whatnot. So we start, entangling and unmaking those borders that divide us. This is another example as well that I love of artist and architect Héctor Zamora, that at one point in time when the museum, the Carrillo Gil Museum in Mexico City offered for him to make an installation, and so he hacked the building, which is really interesting because it's neither the museum, so it isn't the rules of the museum, but since it doesn't touch the ground, it's not the city laws either. And he created his studio there for 4 months. So he would sleep there, he would work there, he would eat there, he would shower there. And I think that there's such possibility in thinking about these little Trojan horses to inhabit the gaps. So yes, the story of modernity is a story of separation, but it is the myth of separation. This is a story that we have told ourselves, which is actually not true in many ways. So could there be more imaginative ways of living, being, belonging, more akin to that hyper-collectivity that we already are? One of the examples that I love, because I showed you small interventions, but this is actually the former mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mocus. I mean, only in Latin America can you get away with dressing as a superhero as a mayor, which I love. And he thought of the city not in its technocratic form, not in terms of the city as computer, but the city as classroom, which was such a beautiful thing. And you may think, oh, that's cute, that's sweet, that's fun, but what effects does it have? These are the effects. His strategy on civic culture and urban pedagogies actually got 70% decrease in homicide rates during his 4 years. Traffic accidents got reduced by 50%, and 63,000 people voluntarily gave 10% extra tax when they heard what he wanted to do with the taxes. So civic culture does work. Political imagination does work. And just like as an added little thing that I learned recently in terms of our collective self. So we have 30 trillion human cells, but we actually have 39 trillion microbial cells in our body, which means we are only 43% human in many ways. Just think about that. So my new wild child, which is my new organization, starting in July, actually will be called the Institute for Everything in Between. And I really want to think deeply with all of you about what this in-between space actually means. So I was incredibly happy with the invitation, as you can imagine, from Budapest, and I'm incredibly interested in emerging knowledges, emerging practices, emerging territories, and the things, again, that emerge between us. Because we are all boundary workers in many ways. We are troubling the boundaries. We are both creating our sense of being and belonging, and also the collectivity that we all are. We're also third spacers, if you will. And we are all multitudes inside and outside as well. So we are all creatures of the edge, and the edge is alive, as they say. Thank you very much.